Look at the device you're listening to this on right now. I mean, just think about it for a second.
Yeah, it's probably a smartphone or a laptop, right?
Exactly. And in the last 24 hours, you, as the listener, have probably consumed media produced in London, bought a product manufactured in Shenzhen, and used software coded in Bangalore.
Which is just a totally normal Tuesday for most people now.
Right. And the prevailing narrative of our modern era tells you that because of this, you are this citizen of a borderless globe. We are constantly told that technology and trade have completely erased national boundaries.
Rendering geography entirely obsolete, essentially.
Exactly. Like we are living supposedly in this hyper-connected, frictionless global village where capital and culture just flow freely. I mean, the consensus is overwhelming. The world is flat.
It is an incredibly seductive narrative. And, it is easy to see why we fall for it.
Oh, absolutely.
We look at the smartphones in our hands, we look at the instant communication of the internet, and we naturally assume that physical distance it no longer dictates human behavior.
But the mission of our deep dive today is to pull you back from what our sources suggest might just be, honestly, a mass delusion.
A very persistent mass delusion.
Yeah. We are looking at a really fascinating stack of materials you provided for this deep dive. It's centered heavily on Pankaj Ghemawat's seminal 2007 analysis, Why the World Isn't Flat.
A classic in this field, definitely.
And these sources systematically dismantle this widespread belief. We are going to examine the hard mathematical data proving that the world is actually only a fraction as integrated as we all assume it is.
The math really does not lie here.
No, it doesn't. Okay, let's unpack this. Because subscribing to the flat world theory is a lot like believing you are deeply personally close to a celebrity just because you follow them on social media.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. You see their daily updates, you know their dog's name, you know what they had for lunch, and it creates this intense artificial illusion of intimacy. But in reality,
You don't know them at all.
exactly, you don't know them at all. The underlying connection is entirely superficial.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the discrepancy between perception and reality here. The illusion of intimacy versus the stark reality of distance.
Yeah.
And to understand how policymakers and the public got so completely caught up in this illusion, well, we have to examine the sheer volume of the hype surrounding globalization.
It was everywhere in the 2000s, right?
Oh, it was inescapable. The source material points out that by the early 2000s, globalization wasn't merely an economic trend being studied. It had morphed into a booming cottage industry of its own.
Right, like an actual industry.
Exactly. Just look at the publishing data. Throughout the entire decade of the 1990s, there were roughly 500 books published on the topic of globalization.
Okay, 510 years.
Right. But between the years 2000 and 2004 alone, that number exploded to over 4,000.
Wait, 4,000 in just 4 years?
Yes.
That is a staggering acceleration.
Right.
You are talking about a publishing rate that is essentially doubling every 18 months. I mean, it became an intellectual gold rush.
Precisely. And leading that charge, setting the intellectual tempo for the era, was Thomas Friedman's incredibly famous book, The World is Flat.
Right. I remember everyone reading that.
Yeah, he argued that technological forces were leveling the global playing field in a way humanity had never seen before, basically democratizing commerce and information.
But as our sources highlight, so much of this literature relies heavily on emotional appeals.
Heavily.
It relies on, technological prophecy, on viewing every new gadget or fiber optic cable as a definitive sign of the quote-unquote end of history, the death of the nation state.
Which is a very bold claim to make based on a faster internet connection.
Exactly. So today, we are stripping away the prophecy. We're moving away from the airport bookstore theories and looking directly at what the mathematical reality actually says about the permeability of our borders.
The actual spreadsheets, so to speak.
Right. If the literary hype was telling us that borders were gone, what did the actual spreadsheets of multinational corporations and global economists show?
And this brings us directly to the core finding of Ghemawat's research.
Yes, the 10% presumption. And I have to admit, when I first read through this data, I was struggling to square it with my own daily life.
Because it feels wrong, intuitively.
It really does. The sources reveal that over 90% of all phone calls, web traffic, and investment is strictly local. Statistically speaking, almost everything we do is domestic.
It forces a complete recalibration of how we view the global economy. I mean, we assume that capital flows seamlessly around the globe, seeking the best returns regardless of geography.
That's what they teach in Economics 101.
Exactly. But the data on foreign direct investment, or FDI, tells a remarkably different story. FDI is essentially when a company in one country builds a physical factory or buys a controlling stake in a business in another country.
It's the bedrock of deep economic integration. Right?
Exactly. Yet, between 2003 and 2005, FDI accounted for less than 10% of all global capital formation.
So just to put that in perspective for you listening, out of every $100 of fixed investment happening around the world, every new factory built, every new machine purchased, over $90 of it is entirely domestic.
Yes. It's staying firmly within the home country's borders.
And the sources note that even when there's a massive wave of global corporate mergers, that FDI number has never even hit the 20% mark.
Never.
If we lived in a truly flat, completely globalized environment, you would expect that number to reflect the size of the global market. It should be closer to like 80 or 90%, not hovering under 10.
Exactly. And this 10% ceiling is remarkably stubborn. It isn't just isolated to corporate investment either.
Right, it's everywhere.
It applies across an incredibly broad spectrum of human activity. Look at cross-border migration, roughly 10%. Management research. Private charitable giving.
Also 10%.
Yep. The registration of patents, international stock investment, all of these metrics hover much closer to that 10% mark than to 100%.
Which is why he calls it the 10% presumption. If you had to blindly guess how internationalized any given economic activity is, well, statistically, your safest bet is about 10%.
It's a very solid rule of thumb based on this data.
But I need to push back on this a bit because, I'm looking at global financial hubs.
Okay, let's hear.
You take cities like New York, London, Frankfurt, Hong Kong. These hubs are undeniably incredibly intertwined. We are talking about billions of dollars moving between them at the speed of light 24 hours a day.
That is undeniably true.
So doesn't this extreme high-speed connectivity at the very top of the financial food chain prove the flat world theorists right to some degree?
What's fascinating here is how easily we mistake a few highly connected nodes for a completely connected network.
Oh, that's interesting.
The extreme connectivity you were describing between a handful of specific localized hubs does not equate to a flat global landscape. Frankfurt and Hong Kong might be deeply connected to each other via specialized financial architecture.
But the rest of the country isn't.
Exactly. That doesn't mean the entire world, or even the rest of Germany and China, is operating on a level playing field. The reality our sources describe is not a globalized world, but a semi-globalized one.
A semi-globalized world, meaning it's not entirely walled off, but it's far from completely open.
Correct. In this semi-globalized reality, both the bridges connecting countries and the barriers separating them are incredibly significant.
Right, you can't ignore either of them.
Yeah, the actual mathematical average level of internationalization is roughly an order of magnitude lower, meaning 10 times lower than what the proponents of a flat world actively claim.
Okay, I can grasp that physical capital and physical trade are still overwhelmingly domestic. I mean, building a factory is a massive physical undertaking.
Huge. It takes years and so much local coordination.
Right, and shipping steel or agricultural products across an ocean involves physical logistics, customs, tariffs. It makes perfect sense that physical stuff is bound by physical borders.
It's unavoidable friction.
But if we pivot to cyberspace, shouldn't the rules be different? I mean, the internet costs practically nothing to send an email or access a server on the other side of the planet.
That's the dream of the internet, yes.
Surely, the digital realm is the one place where borders have truly vanished.
It is the most common assumption we make about technology. But the data shows that the sticky, stubborn reality of borders extends right into the digital realm.
Really?
Yeah. Even in cyberspace, internet connectivity actually decays with distance.
The sources provide a really illuminating example of this with a South Korean web user.
Yes, the broadband example.
Right. South Korea is one of the most wired, broadband-saturated nations on Earth. The average user there spends hours online every single day.
They have the infrastructure to do anything globally.
Theoretically, yes. They possess the infrastructure to interact seamlessly with the entire planet. But the data asks, what are they actually doing with all that bandwidth?
And the answer is very local.
Exactly. They are chatting with local friends across town. They're reading local news. They are emailing family members on the other side of the country.
They are not using this phenomenal global infrastructure to socialize with random surfers in Los Angeles.
No. Why would they?
Because human relationships and cultural affinities are deeply localized. We are significantly more wired, yes, but we are not inherently more global in our behavior.
We just do our local stuff, but faster.
Exactly. We utilize this incredible global infrastructure primarily to reinforce our pre-existing local connections.
And what's amazing is how this localized gravity affects even the biggest, most sophisticated tech giants. I mean, the sources highlight Google's expansion efforts back in 2007.
Really telling case study.
At that time, Google was widely considered the apex predator of the digital world, the absolute most globalized website on the planet. But in Russia, they were hitting a massive wall.
Massive wall.
Google only managed to capture a 28% market share there.
And we have to ask why a tech behemoth with seemingly unlimited resources and honestly superior underlying search algorithms would struggle so profoundly in a connected digital market.
Right. The internet wasn't blocked.
No, it wasn't because the internet was broken at the Russian border. It was because local competitors, specifically Yandex and Rambler, completely dominated the space.
Yeah. The sources say together they controlled over 90% of the Russian market for online advertisements linked to search.
90%.
And the mechanism behind that dominance is the crucial part. It wasn't just like nationalistic preference.
Right.
It was deep, localized complexity.
Well, language is a huge part of that.
Exactly. Yandex and Rambler had mastered the extreme linguistic complexities of the Russian language. Things like complex Cyrillic morphology.
Which Google's global search engine initially just struggled to process accurately.
Right. But even beyond language, they adapted to local physical realities.
This is the really interesting part.
Yeah. The sources note that because credit cards were not widely used by Russian consumers at that time, these local search engines developed alternative physical payment systems.
Systems that ran through traditional brick-and-mortar banks.
Right. Which demonstrates that you cannot simply export a digital business model without interacting with the physical infrastructure of a specific geography.
No, you can't. To compete, Google literally had to hire local Russian software engineers and set up a physical office in Moscow.
They had to localize to survive.
Exactly. So even digital behemoths are bound by geography, language, and local banking culture.
And if we look at traditional trade, this home bias is so deeply embedded that even when governments actively try to legislate it away, it just remains.
It is incredibly stubborn.
The sources use NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as a prime example of this.
Yes. If you want to see the limits of a flat world, look at what happens when you legally erase a physical border.
Right. Before NAFTA, trade between Canadian provinces, meaning domestic internal trade, was estimated to be 20 times larger than Canada's trade with similarly sized and similarly distant U.S. states.
A massive 20-to-1 home bias.
Yeah.
Now, NAFTA was explicitly designed to eliminate those tariffs and flatten that specific part of the world. And it did reduce the bias.
But not entirely.
Not even close. Even by the mid-1990s, after free trade was firmly established and tariffs were largely gone, the ratio of domestic to international merchandise trade still exceeded 5-to-1.
Wow.
And for services, the home bias was even higher.
You know, I always used to think of this home bias as simply a preference. Like going to a massive, incredibly diverse international food court, and despite having 50 global options, you just wait in line for the burger joint from your hometown.
Because you like what you know.
Right. But looking at these mechanisms, it's not just preference. It is less like choosing a different cuisine and more like trying to plug a European appliance into an American wall outlet.
That is a much more accurate mechanism to visualize.
The physical distance between the U.S. and Canada might be short, but the structural friction is huge. You have different legal frameworks, currency exchange risks, entirely different logistical and distribution networks.
You need a lot of expensive adapters to make that trade work, even without tariffs.
Exactly.
Regulatory friction, currency risk, and institutional differences create invisible borders that are just as formidable as physical checkpoints.
Yeah, you don't see them, but they're there.
Geography, time zones, language, they still profoundly dictate human behavior and the flow of business. We see this even in industries that were heralded as the ultimate, undeniable proof of a flat world.
Oh, you mean the Indian IT outsourcing boom? Thomas Friedman's absolute favorite example.
Exactly. Friedman looked at Indian software firms like Tata Consultancy Services or TCS setting up operations in Uruguay to service American banks.
Right, he loved that one.
He presented this as the new normal of a borderless world where talent could be deployed anywhere instantly.
But it wasn't.
No. The source text, drawing from someone who actively advised TCS, points out that the decision to open a facility in Uruguay was driven precisely by the barriers of geography, not the absence of them.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They didn't go to Uruguay because geography didn't matter. They went there because they were trying to solve the tyranny of time zones.
Oh, right. If you're servicing a U.S. bank, you need engineers awake when the bank is awake.
Exactly. And they needed Spanish language skills to service the broader Latin American market, and they needed the ability to physically put managers on short flights to meet with clients.
So they were highly constrained by geography.
Very much so. And the sources also point out that the success of Indian firms like Infosys in servicing the U.S. market isn't just about flat world talent.
What else is it about?
It is largely because massive amounts of U.S. capital are heavily invested in them, ensuring them access to that specific market. The country of origin or capital still dictates who gets to play the game.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we accept this data, if we accept that true global integration is remarkably low, resting on this fragile 10% thread, and highly constrained by physical and cultural friction,
Yes.
it forces us to confront an even more startling realization. The little globalization we do have, it isn't a guaranteed permanent trajectory. It can be completely undone.
This is perhaps the most crucial and honestly sobering takeaway from the historical data provided in our sources.
Because we think of it as a one-way street, right?
Exactly. Because we live in an era of rapid technological advancement, we tend to view economic globalization as an inevitable march forward that moves in tandem with innovation. But history tells a very different story.
The statistic that completely altered my perspective on this was about human migration.
The 1900s stat.
Yes. According to the data, in the year 1900, long-term international migrants made up 3% of the world's total population.
Which represents the high watermark of an earlier, highly integrated era of migration.
Right. And in 2005, after a century of commercial aviation, high-speed rail, and the internet supposedly shrinking the globe, that number had actually fallen to 2.9%.
It actually went down.
We were technically more globally integrated in terms of human movement over a century ago than we were in the early 2000s. And it is not just the movement of people.
No, the flow of capital follows the exact same fragile trajectory. Foreign direct investment stocks, measured relative to global GDP, peaked right before the outbreak of World War I.
Pre-World War I.
And they did not recover to those pre-war levels until the 1990s. We saw a massive sustained decline in internationalization during the interwar period.
I am looking at this historical data, and I am honestly struggling to understand the massive blind spot of the late 20th century.
It was a very optimistic time.
But how did so many brilliant minds in the 1990s get this so wrong? You read prominent economists from that era, like Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner in 1995, and they were definitively declaring that one dominant global economic system is emerging.
They were very confident.
Very. They looked at the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening of Chinese and Indian markets, and they basically called the game. They thought borders were a relic of the past. How did the consensus misread the trend that badly?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental flaw in that 1990s optimism was the assumption that human policies are permanent fixtures.
Like technology.
Right, much like technological discoveries, Sachs and Warner were observing very real, very significant policy openings. The collapse of the Soviet bloc was a monumental shift.
Absolutely.
But human policies, unlike the invention of the microchip, are highly reversible. Deep international economic integration might actually be inherently incompatible with national sovereignty.
Incompatible. Walk me through the mechanics of that. Why can't a sovereign nation just choose to be deeply integrated?
Because integration requires a surrender of autonomy.
Okay, also.
When a nation deeply integrates its economy with the global market, it inherently loses a degree of control over its own domestic affairs. If you peg your currency to global markets to encourage trade, you lose the ability to control your own interest rates.
Right, you're tied to the larger system.
If you open your borders entirely to free trade, you expose your local industries to global supply gluts and cheaper foreign labor. the nation becomes highly vulnerable to external shocks that its own government just cannot control.
And when everyday voters feel the economic pain of that loss of control, when factories close or inflation spikes due to foreign crises, they react politically.
Exactly.
And the source text documents this exact political reversal happening in real time. They point to the 1997 Asian currency crisis as a major inflection point.
That was a huge wake-up call.
It really was. This crisis severely frayed what was known as the Washington Consensus, which was essentially the 1990s playbook pushed by Western institutions that told developing nations to rapidly deregulate and open their financial markets.
And what happened when they did?
Hot money flowed in, panicked, and flowed rapidly back out, crashing their local economies and leaving voters devastated.
Exactly. The promised stability of the flat world proved highly volatile. And the sources also point to the complete suspension of the Doha round of global trade talks in the summer of 2006.
And just to clarify for you listening, the Doha round was supposed to be a massive World Trade Organization agreement aimed at lowering trade barriers worldwide.
It was supposed to be the ultimate triumph of globalization.
But it collapsed entirely because the political realities of borders trumped global economic theory. Developing nations wanted access to Western agricultural markets, but politicians in developed nations could not politically afford to eliminate subsidies for their own local farmers.
The domestic political blowback was just too severe.
Which aligns with what the sources identify as a rising wave of neopopulism and protectionism sweeping across various parts of the globe.
A trend that has only continued.
Yes, and just to be completely clear, we are not endorsing or condemning any of these political movements. We are simply reporting what the data in our sources outlines regarding the structural barriers to further globalization.
It's just the reality of the data.
Exactly. The text explicitly notes this rise in protectionist sentiment among voters as a massive, tangible roadblock to the flat world theory.
It is an empirical observation of voter behavior reacting to economic exposure. In fact, to highlight how deeply rooted the sentiment is, the text quotes Jeff Immelt.
He's the CEO of General Electric at the time.
Yes, speaking in 2006, he stated, very flatly, if you put globalization to a popular vote in the U.S., it would lose.
That is striking, because 2006 predates the 2008 global financial crash. It significantly predates the massive populist waves we saw in the 2010s. A major corporate CEO is looking at the data and realizing the cracks in the foundation were already there long before the earthquake actually hit.
Yes. The underlying tensions between global integration and local sovereignty were already manifesting.
It wasn't a sudden shift.
No, not at all. The path of globalization is definitively not a smooth, straight line upwards toward a borderless utopia. It is highly fragile.
Very fragile.
It is subject to severe external shocks, cyclical economic downturns, and as the historical data from the early 20th century unequivocally shows, it is vulnerable to decades-long periods of absolute reversal.
So what does this all mean? I mean, why does it matter if someone writes an optimistic bestseller claiming the world is flat, even if the spreadsheets prove it's really only about 10% integrated?
That matters a great deal.
Well, for you, as someone trying to understand how the modern world actually operates, believing in a flat world isn't just a harmless intellectual mistake.
Far from it.
According to our sources, it is a fundamentally dangerous basis for corporate strategy and government policymaking.
It all comes down to the danger of what Thomas Friedman termed the golden straitjacket.
Okay, break that down for us.
This is the underlying assumption that in a flat, globalized world, pure economics dictate everything, and local politics matter less and less.
Right, the idea that governments just have to put on the straitjacket, accept the one-size-fits-all rules of the free market, and the flat world will automatically deliver prosperity and stability.
Exactly. But if governments and corporations buy into this delusion, they become completely blind to real-world constraints.
They ignore the friction of geography.
They ignore linguistic complexities and cultural barriers.
And most dangerously, they ignore the inevitable political blowback from their own citizens who still very much live, work, and vote in a bordered world.
They optimize their supply chains, their policies, and their entire worldview for a reality that simply does not exist.
And that optimization leaves them entirely unprepared, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Highly vulnerable when the very real, very stubborn borders of our physical and political world suddenly reassert themselves.
It is a profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
We are not citizens of an inevitable borderless utopia.
We never really were.
We are living in a complex, semi-globalized world held together by a surprisingly thin 10% thread of integration.
And that leaves us with a critical, honestly, somewhat unsettling thought to consider as we look to the future.
I'm ready?
If this 10% thread of globalization we currently rely on is as fragile and reversible as the historical data suggests, what happens when the next massive global shock hits?
Oh, wow.
Say, a sudden catastrophic collapse of international supply chains or a major geopolitical conflict that halts the flow of physical goods.
Which feels entirely possible.
Right. Will nations look at that crisis, realize how utterly crucial that small thread of integration is to their survival, and fight to strengthen it? Or will that massive shock serve as the exact excuse they use to finally cut the cord, given entirely to that powerful home bias, and retreat behind their borders for another generation?
That is a heavy, very real question to walk away with. It changes how you look at every headline about international trade or digital expansion.
It really reframes the whole conversation.
Thank you for bringing such an eye-opening set of sources to the deep dive today. It just goes to show why we can never take the popular, comfortable consensus at face value.
My pleasure. Always look at the data.
Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking at the hard mathematical data, and remember, just because you can follow the entire world on a glass screen doesn't mean you actually live in a flat one. We'll catch you next time.